Nelson DeLuca, the ruthless mafia president, has spent years building his empire in the shadows of Italy's criminal underworld. Cold, calculated, and driven by vengeance, he rules with an iron fist. His greatest enemy, Veronica Moretti, has been the bane of his existence, constantly disrupting Nelson's business, challenging his authority, and endangering his power. The feud between the DeLuca and Moretti families stretches back decades, steeped in bloodshed, betrayal, and the constant threat of war. On the other side of the city, Veronica Moretti, Dante's only daughter, lives in a completely different world. She's sheltered from the dark realities of her father's empire, having spent most of her life away from the violence that surrounds the Moretti name. Educated abroad, Veronica is refined, gentle, and independent. She has always sought to distance herself from her family's criminal ties, dreaming of a life far from the blood-stained legacy that her father's name carries. Unbeknownst to Veronica, her return to Italy sets off a chain of events that will plunge her into the center of the deadly rivalry between the DeLuca and Moretti families. As tensions rise between their respective worlds, Nelson and Veronica are fated to cross paths in a way neither of them could have anticipated. It was a lavish charity gala, hosted by one of the city's elite families. The wealthy and powerful of Italy had gathered in their finest attire, drinking expensive champagne and exchanging polite conversation. Nelson attended as part of his public persona, a respected businessman, hiding his mafia dealings behind a veil of respectability. He moved through the crowd with a commanding presence, his dark eyes surveying the room for potential allies and enemies alike. Veronica, reluctantly attending on behalf of her father, stood near the edge of the ballroom, feeling out of place among the glittering guests. She had never cared for the world of wealth and power, preferring to live a quiet, academic life. But her father had insisted she return to Italy for the gala, and so here she was, draped in a simple yet elegant gown that mirrored her understated beauty. As Nelson passed by a collection of modern art on display, his attention was suddenly drawn to a young woman who was admiring a sculpture. There was something about her, a quiet grace that caught his eye. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and her gaze held a softness that was rare in his world of hardened criminals. Intrigued, he approached her, more out of curiosity than anything else. "Quite the piece, isn't it?" Nelson said, his voice smooth yet commanding. Veronica turned, meeting his gaze. She was taken aback by his striking appearance. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an aura of danger, Nelson was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. "Yes," Veronica replied softly, "it's beautiful." Their conversation was brief, but charged with an unspoken tension. There was something magnetic about Nelson that drew Veronica in, though she couldn't quite understand why. Meanwhile, Nelson, who was used to controlling every aspect of his life, felt an unfamiliar stirring as he looked into Veronica's eyes. It was as if, for the first time in years, he had found someone he couldn't easily control or manipulate. As they parted ways, neither of them knew that this seemingly innocent encounter would change the course of their lives forever. After their initial meeting at the gala, Nelson couldn't get Veronica out of his mind. It wasn't just her beauty that haunted him. It was her innocence, her purity. She was so unlike the women in his world, hardened by crime and power plays. Nelson found himself thinking about her at odd times, wondering what it would be like to see her again. But when his men reported back that she was the daughter of his greatest enemy, Veronica Moretti, his fascination quickly turned to cold resolve. Veronica was off limits. She was the daughter of the man who had ruined Nelson's life, who had killed his father and plunged the DeLuca family into an endless war. Pursuing her would not only be foolish but dangerous. Yet, despite his better judgment, Nelson found himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. Meanwhile, Veronica, too, found herself thinking about Nelson. There was something about him that intrigued her, something that made her want to learn more about the man behind the intense, dark eyes. She knew nothing about his criminal background, nor did she realize the deep-rooted animosity between their families. To her, Nelson was just a mysterious stranger who had left an indelible impression on her heart. Their paths crossed again, this time at a private art exhibition. It was another chance meeting, or so it seemed. In truth, Nelson had arranged to be there, unable to resist the temptation of seeing Veronica again. When their eyes met, it was as though the rest of the world disappeared. They spoke more this time, delving into deeper conversations about art, life, and their shared desire for something beyond the lives they were born into. For Veronica, Nelson represented a break from the suffocating expectations of her family. For Nelson, Veronica was a glimpse of the light in a world shrouded in darkness. Despite the impossibility of their situation, the attraction between them grew stronger with each encounter. As their secret meetings continued, Nelson and Veronica found themselves falling deeper into a love neither had expected. They met in secluded places, away from the prying eyes of the mafia world. Every stolen moment felt like an escape from the violence and power struggles that defined their lives. Nelson, who had spent his entire life building walls around his heart, was slowly letting Veronica in. She saw the man behind the mafia president, the man who had once been a boy, torn apart by the brutal loss of his father. She saw his vulnerability, his desire to protect the people he loved, and the loneliness that came with being at the top of a criminal empire. Veronica, in turn, found in Nelson a kindred spirit. Despite the coldness he showed to the outside world, with her, he was different. He was kind, protective, and even gentle in ways that surprised her. As they spent more time together, she found herself falling for him, despite the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. But the danger of their relationship loomed large. Nelson knew that if Dante ever found out about their love, it would mean war, one that could destroy them both. Yet, as much as he tried to push Veronica away, he couldn't. She had become the one thing he couldn't give up, the one thing that made him feel alive. As the tension between the DeLuca and Moretti families escalated, Nelson and Veronica found themselves caught in the middle of a war that neither of them could escape. But with each passing day, their love grew stronger, even as the world around them threatened to tear them apart. The secrecy surrounding Nelson and Veronica's relationship became increasingly difficult to maintain. Nelson's second-in-command, Marco, began to notice changes in his boss. Nelson, once a man who lived by calculated ruthlessness, seemed distracted, softer even. Marco's suspicion deepened as Nelson started disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. Marco knew better than to question Nelson directly, but his loyalty to the DeLuca family drove him to investigate the cause of Nelson's recent absences. On the Moretti side, Veronica's father, Dante, was growing restless. He had noticed his daughter becoming distant since her return from abroad. As a controlling and overprotective father, he was worried about her wandering off and jeopardizing her safety in the midst of a brewing mafia war. Unbeknownst to him, Veronica's secrecy was not related to any reckless behavior, but to her growing love for the man he despised more than anyone else in the world. One evening, as Veronica sat in her small art studio, painting to calm her nerves, she received a call from Nelson. His voice was unusually tense, and he told her to meet him at their secret location near the coast. When she arrived, she could sense something was off. Nelson's typically composed demeanor was unraveling, and he seemed conflicted. "Veronica, there's something you need to know," he began, his voice low and serious. Nelson could no longer keep the truth hidden from her. As much as he wanted to protect her from the reality of their world, she needed to know who he truly was, and more importantly, who her father was. Over the course of a tense conversation, Nelson revealed his true identity. He was the head of the DeLuca Mafia, the sworn enemy of her father. Veronica's heart sank as the weight of his confession hit her. She felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. Nelson, the man she had come to love, was part of the very world she had been trying to escape. Worse, he was the mortal enemy of her father. But even as the gravity of the situation settled in, Veronica realized that her feelings for Nelson hadn't changed. She loved him, despite the truth of who he was. However, as much as Veronica wanted to hold on to that love, she knew that the truth had now placed them both in unimaginable danger. In the days following Nelson's confession, Veronica grappled with her feelings of betrayal and love. She knew that continuing their relationship would not only place her in danger, but also escalate the war between the Moretti and DeLuca families. But every time she thought of walking away from Nelson, the thought of losing him crushed her. For Nelson, the stakes were equally high. He knew that his enemies, especially Dante, would come after him if they found out about his relationship with Veronica. Yet, despite the risks, Nelson could not bring himself to let her go. She had become his reason for wanting a life beyond the endless cycle of violence and revenge. Things took a more dangerous turn when Marco, Nelson's right-hand man, followed him to one of his secret meetings with Veronica. Marco was shocked to see Nelson in such an intimate moment with none other than Dante Moretti's daughter. As soon as he realized who she was, Marco's loyalty to the DeLuca family took over. Without hesitation, he reported the affair to the DeLuca elders, sparking a wave of distrust and unrest within the mafia ranks. Back at the Moretti mansion, Dante's suspicions were also growing. He hired a private investigator to follow Veronica, suspecting that she was hiding something. When the investigator reported back with photographs of her secret meetings with Nelson, Dante was livid. His own daughter had betrayed him by consorting with the man who had killed his brother and nearly ruined his empire. With both families on the brink of discovering their relationship, Nelson and Veronica found themselves running out of time. They knew they had to make a decision, to either end their love for the sake of their families or risk everything to be together. In the dead of night, Nelson made his choice. He called Veronica and told her to pack her things. They would leave together and disappear before their respective families could tear them apart. The night was dark and silent as Nelson and Veronica made their way out of the city, leaving behind the lives they had known for so long. Veronica felt a sense of liberation, despite the danger that now hung over them like a storm cloud. She had chosen love over loyalty to her family, and although the decision filled her with uncertainty, she felt that as long as she was with Nelson, she could face anything. Nelson, on the other hand, was conflicted. For the first time in his life, he was running from a fight. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed, was now being left behind for a woman. But as he glanced at Veronica sitting beside him in the passenger seat, he knew that she was worth every risk. She was the first person who had ever seen the real Nelson. Not the mafia leader, but the man beneath the armor. They drove through the countryside, far from the city, seeking refuge in a secluded estate that Nelson had kept hidden even from his closest allies. It was a temporary escape, a sanctuary where they could hide while they figured out their next move. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to dream of a life together, one free from the violence and bloodshed that defined their worlds. Nelson imagined leaving the mafia behind, starting anew in a place where they could live in peace. Veronica, too, began to see a future where love triumphed over hate. But reality came crashing back when they received a call from Marco. The DeLuca family had discovered Nelson's betrayal, and they were coming for him. Worse still, Dante had mobilized his men, determined to bring Veronica back and punish her for her disloyalty. Their love had ignited a firestorm, and there was no escaping the flames. With both the DeLuca and Moretti families hot on their trail, Nelson and Veronica were forced to go on the run once again. But as the net tightened around them, Nelson realized there was only one way to protect Veronica, to take control of the situation. He could no longer run from his enemies. He had to confront them head-on. Nelson devised a plan to broker a truce between the two warring families. He knew that the only way to prevent further bloodshed was to meet with Dante and propose a ceasefire. It was a risky move, one that could easily backfire, but Nelson was willing to do anything to keep Veronica safe. Veronica, terrified of what might happen, pleaded with Nelson to reconsider. She feared that Dante's hatred for Nelson ran too deep, and any meeting would only result in more violence. But Nelson was resolute. He had spent his entire life fighting for power and control, and now he was fighting for something even more important, his future with Veronica. The day of the meeting arrived, and tensions were high. Nelson and Veronica stood side by side as they waited for Dante to arrive at a neutral location, a remote warehouse far from the city. Armed men from both sides surrounded the perimeter, their fingers on the triggers, ready to start a war at a moment's notice. When Dante finally arrived, his eyes were filled with fury as he saw his daughter standing next to the man he had vowed to destroy. But before he could act, Nelson stepped forward, his voice calm yet commanding. "We can keep fighting, Dante," Nelson said, "but where will it end? More blood, more death? Or we can end it here. I love your daughter, and I will protect her, no matter the cost." Dante, torn between his love for Veronica and his hatred for Nelson, stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and sharp. "If you truly love her, then prove it." The standoff was intense, but Nelson had made his choice. He was willing to give up his empire, his power, and everything he had built for the woman he loved. It was a sacrifice he had never imagined making, but for Veronica, it was worth it. Dante, seeing the sincerity in Nelson's eyes, finally relented. The war between the DeLuca and Moretti families was over, and Veronica's love had brought an end to decades of bloodshed. As the dust of the confrontation settled, Nelson and Veronica were left to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The truce between the DeLuca and Moretti families was shaky at best, held together by the thin thread of love between two people from opposing sides. But for now, the guns were silent, and that was enough for both Nelson and Veronica. Veronica stood in the dimly lit warehouse, her hand intertwined with Nelson's, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. She had expected chaos, bloodshed, and perhaps the loss of the man she loved. But instead, Nelson had chosen love over vengeance, and Dante, her father, had begrudgingly accepted their relationship. However, deep down, Veronica knew that peace wouldn't come easily. Dante's acceptance wasn't a victory, it was a temporary ceasefire, a fragile state where one wrong move could reignite the war. She could see the hatred still smoldering in her father's eyes as he walked away, his silence a cold promise that he hadn't forgiven nor forgotten the years of hostility between their families. Nelson, on the other hand, was facing a new kind of battle. His own men, led by Marco, were disillusioned. They had followed Nelson not out of love, but out of fear and respect for his power. Now, they saw his willingness to walk away from the empire he had built as weakness. The loyalty of his crew was crumbling, and Nelson knew it was only a matter of time before someone would try to take his place. That night, as Nelson and Veronica retreated to their safe house in the countryside, they realized that while they had won a temporary reprieve, the war was far from over. They would have to fight, not just against their families, but against the expectations of the world they had grown up in. "I'm not afraid," Veronica whispered, her head resting against Nelson's chest. "We've come too far to turn back now." Nelson kissed her forehead gently, his mind racing with thoughts of how to protect the woman he loved and the life they hoped to build together. While Nelson and Veronica were trying to find their footing in their new reality, betrayal was brewing within the ranks of the DeLuca family. Marco, disillusioned by Nelson's perceived weakness, began to plot against him. Marco had always been loyal to Nelson's vision of a strong, ruthless leader, and he saw Nelson's love for Veronica as a dangerous distraction. Marco reached out to Dante Moretti, believing that by betraying Nelson and aligning with the Moretti family, he could take over the DeLuca empire. In exchange for Dante's support, Marco promised to eliminate Nelson once and for all and return Veronica to her father's side. Dante, still harboring resentment for Nelson, was tempted by the offer. He had begrudgingly allowed his daughter's relationship with Nelson, but deep down, he couldn't stand the idea of his enemy's bloodline mixing with his own. Marco's betrayal offered him a way to regain control without dirtying his own hands. Unaware of the plot against him, Nelson began making plans to leave the mafia life behind. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to carve out a new future with Veronica. They spoke of moving to a different country, where they could live free from the shadow of their family's legacy. However, before they could make any real moves, Nelson received a cryptic message from one of his most trusted men, warning him of Marco's betrayal. The message was clear. Marco had aligned with Dante, and an ambush was imminent. Nelson, now on high alert, prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Marco and Dante's forces. He knew that Marco was cunning and wouldn't attack unless he had the upper hand. Nelson had to act swiftly, but he was torn between protecting Veronica and taking down Marco before he could strike. Veronica, sensing the growing tension in Nelson, insisted on staying by his side, refusing to hide or run. She had chosen this life with him, and she wasn't about to abandon him now, even if it meant facing her father and the betrayal of Nelson's closest ally. The day of the confrontation arrived, and the stage was set at an old, abandoned dockyard, neutral territory where Marco and Dante had planned to lure Nelson into a trap. But Nelson was one step ahead, having gathered his most loyal men for an ambush of his own. As Nelson and Veronica approached the dockyard, the air was thick with anticipation. Veronica's heart pounded in her chest, knowing that this could be the end of everything. She looked at Nelson, his face steely with determination, and whispered, "No matter what happens, I'm with you." The two sides met in a violent clash. Gunfire echoed across the docks as Nelson's men fought to defend their leader. In the chaos, Nelson confronted Marco, who stood with a smirk of betrayal on his face. "You were never strong enough to lead," Marco spat, raising his gun. Nelson's eyes darkened, but before Marco could pull the trigger, a shot rang out from behind. Veronica, having grabbed a gun from one of the fallen men, stood with steady hands, having just saved Nelson's life. Marco collapsed, a look of shock and anger frozen on his face as he bled out onto the cold concrete. The battle was over, but Nelson and Veronica's journey was far from finished. They had survived, but the cost of victory weighed heavily on them both. With Marco's betrayal crushed and the Moretti family in disarray after Dante's failed coup, Nelson and Veronica stood at the precipice of a new chapter in their lives. Nelson's control of the DeLuca empire was secure, but he no longer had the desire to lead. The violence, the bloodshed, it had all taken a toll on him. Veronica, too, had been forever changed by the events that had unfolded. She had seen the darkness of the mafia world up close, but through it all, her love for Nelson had only grown stronger. In the weeks following the battle at the dockyard, Nelson met with the remaining DeLuca elders and announced his decision to step down as head of the family. His announcement was met with shock and disbelief, but Nelson remained firm. He appointed one of his most trusted men to take over, someone who would continue to maintain order without dragging the family into further violence. Veronica, meanwhile, began reaching out to her father. Despite everything that had happened, she still loved Dante and wanted to rebuild their fractured relationship. Over time, Dante, having lost much of his power and influence, came to realize that his hatred had cost him his relationship with his daughter. He begrudgingly agreed to meet with her, and while the road to forgiveness was long, Veronica held on to hope that one day they could reconcile. In the end, Nelson and Veronica left the mafia world behind, retreating to a quiet life in the countryside where they could finally live in peace. Their love had been tested by fire, but they had come out stronger on the other side. Though they had left the shadows of their past behind, Nelson and Veronica knew that the scars of their journey would always remain. But together, they faced the future, no longer enemies bound by bloodlines, but partners bound by love. Nelson and Veronica had finally escaped the suffocating world of the mafia, retreating to a secluded estate in the countryside. It was a world of peace that neither of them had ever known before, far from the violence and betrayal that had surrounded their lives for so long. For the first time in years, Nelson felt a semblance of true freedom. His days were no longer spent managing a criminal empire or dodging enemies. Instead, they were filled with moments of quiet happiness shared with the woman he loved. Veronica, too, was embracing this new chapter. After years of being caught in the crossfire of her father's world, she found joy in the simplicity of life with Nelson. They would spend mornings walking through the lush fields, afternoons tending to their new garden, and evenings in front of the fireplace, talking about their future together. But despite the tranquility, both of them knew that their past wasn't done with them yet. There were still loose ends to tie up, particularly with Veronica's father, Dante Moretti. Though they were no longer in direct conflict, The pain of their estrangement weighed heavily on Veronica. She wanted reconciliation, even if Dante's pride kept him at a distance. Nelson, too, sensed that there was unfinished business between them and the world they had left behind. One day, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Veronica brought up the subject that had been lingering in her mind for weeks. "I think I need to see him," she said softly, her eyes focused on the horizon. "I can't just leave things like this with my father." Nelson nodded, understanding her need for closure. "We can go together, if you want." Veronica smiled faintly. "I have to do this alone, at least the first time. But thank you." As the days passed, Veronica prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation with Dante. She didn't know how he would react to seeing her again, but she hoped that time had softened his heart. It was a chance she had to take, for both of their sakes. Veronica returned to the city alone, her heart racing as she approached the Moretti estate for the first time in months. The memories flooded back as she walked through the gates, the lavish parties, the family dinners, the whispered conversations in darkened hallways. This had once been her world, and yet now, it felt foreign to her. When she arrived at the front door, the servants greeted her with surprise. They had heard rumors of her leaving, but seeing her in person was a different story. With hesitant steps, Veronica made her way to her father's study, the place where so many of their strained conversations had taken place. Dante Moretti sat behind his massive desk, his sharp eyes lifting as the door creaked open. There was a moment of silence as father and daughter locked eyes, the weight of their history filling the room. "You're back," Dante said, his voice gruff but laced with something softer. Relief, perhaps. Veronica swallowed, her throat tight. "I needed to see you. I needed to talk." Dante motioned for her to sit, and she did, feeling the tension between them settle into the air like a thick fog. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were waiting for the other to break the silence. "I know you don't agree with my choices," Veronica finally said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "But I had to live my life the way I saw fit. I had to follow my heart, even if it led me away from the path you set for me." Dante's expression was unreadable, but Veronica could see the pain in his eyes. "I never wanted this for you," he said quietly. "You chose him, DeLuca, after everything I told you, after all the blood spilled between our families." Veronica shook her head. "I didn't choose him to spite you. I chose him because I love him. You of all people should understand that." Dante leaned back. In his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "Love is dangerous in our world. It makes you weak." "No," Veronica said firmly. "It makes you strong. Nelson and I, what we've been through, it's made us stronger than either of us could have imagined. And I'm not asking you to approve of us, but I am asking you to let go of this hatred. It's tearing us apart." The silence that followed was heavy, but Veronica didn't waver. She could see the internal battle her father was fighting, the struggle between his pride and his love for her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dante sighed. "You've always been stubborn, just like your mother." Veronica smiled, her heart lightening. "I learned from the best." There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful embrace. But in that moment, Veronica felt a shift, a small, tentative step toward healing. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Weeks later, Veronica returned to the countryside with a lighter heart. Her conversation with her father hadn't resolved everything, but it had opened a door. They were slowly rebuilding their relationship, one careful step at a time. And for Veronica, that was enough. Nelson greeted her at the front door of their home, his arms wrapping around her as soon as she stepped inside. "How did it go?" he asked, concern in his voice. Veronica smiled, resting her head against his chest. "It went better than I expected. He's not ready to fully forgive everything, but we're talking, and that's a start." Nelson kissed the top of her head. "I'm glad. You deserve that peace." As the weeks turned into months, Nelson and Veronica settled into their new life together. The mafia world seemed like a distant memory, something they had both survived but no longer belonged to. They had made the decision to start a family, wanting to bring new life into the peaceful world they had fought so hard to create. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch of their estate, watching the sunset over the rolling hills, Nelson turned to Veronica with a soft smile. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" he asked. Veronica laughed lightly. "All the time. It's hard to believe sometimes, isn't it?" Nelson nodded, his eyes full of love and admiration. "We've been through so much, but I wouldn't change a thing. Every fight, every challenge, it led me to you." Veronica squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with emotion. "And I wouldn't change a thing either." As they sat there, hand in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew that they had finally found the peace they had been searching for. Their love had survived the fires of war, betrayal, and loss, and now it would thrive in the warmth of a new beginning. Together, they had written a story of redemption, of love conquering all, and of two souls bound together by fate, even in the darkest of times. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Nelson and Veronica looked toward the future, knowing that whatever came their way, they would face it side by side. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.